week, Esther gave what I thought was a beautiful sermon titled "The Way God Sees You." And it was this reflection on how our self-image, which can often be negative, seeing ourselves as inadequate, unworthy, and then the coinciding self-talk, these thoughts like, I'm not good enough, that those things don't always line up to how God sees us, to how this gracious and loving God who created and calls us sees us. And you have to forgive me, I have small children, but this reminded me very much of my favorite VeggieTales episode. And there's some laughter, so I'm imagining that VeggieTales is familiar to some of you. If you don't know what VeggieTales is, just raise your hand so I can see how many people I'm going to lose. Okay, a couple. So there are these vegetables, that's why it's called VeggieTales, and Bob the tomato and Larry the cucumber, and it's a Christian cartoon, and they do much like Jesus did. They tell stories, they tell parables to teach children the Bible and other things. And so my favorite episode is called A Snoodle's Tale. And it's about a Snoodle boy from Snoodleburg in the land of Galoots. And he's weighed down by these pictures that he carries of himself in his backpack. That tell him, these pictures tell him that he's puny, he's silly, he's not that smart, he can't use his wings because Snoodles fly, and he's no good at art. Until he encounters this stranger who happens to be God, who looks at the pictures the boy is carrying one by one and then exclaims, "Dear boy, these look nothing like you." And then God destroys all the pictures and he tells the boy to wait there for a minute because what the boy needs is a new picture from him. So God says, "Dear little Snoodle, it's time that you learn what you really look like." And he hands the boy a picture, and this picture warms the boy right to his feet. And the Snoodle boy says, "Sir, are you saying that's me? I'd like to believe it, but sir, I'm afraid to." God then responds in a way that reveals to the boy his own identity. "I know who you are, for I made you." Isn't that great? Now, if you've not seen A Snoodle's Tale, you can Google it. It's on YouTube. But what I would encourage you, there's a couple of blogs where people have printed the entire manuscript for the story of Snoodle's Tale, and it really is wonderful, and I encourage you to read it. But I say this night, thanks be to God, that God always sees us for who God made us to be. And even if it really can be so hard for us to see ourselves in the same way. So tonight what I wanted to do is take this idea about the way God sees us one step further. Because God not only calls us to be ourselves and to behave according to how God sees us, but that God calls us to be ourselves bravely. God says to all of us, "I know who you are, for I made you. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. So be you." But not only that, be you bravely. This idea of be you bravely actually came to me in Esther's sermon, but also because tomorrow morning I'm going to be sharing a devotion with our Mothers of Preschoolers group, which is a very large group. And their theme this year is Be You Bravely. And it led me to think about what I have come to call this week, after spending some time with the story, the Great Commissioning, which is the story of when God called Joshua to replace Moses as the leader of the people of Israel and to lead them across the Jordan River. So before I read the scripture, I wanted to give a brief synopsis of the history that leads up to this moment. The people of Israel had been landless for almost 500 years. The fathers Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his 12 sons had been nomads in the land of Canaan. That was followed by over 400 years of slavery in Egypt, which ended with their miraculous deliverance into freedom that was led by Moses, the Exodus story. And then, after they were delivered into freedom, they spent 40 years in the desert that Eugene Peterson called testing and training for living as a free people under God's guidance and blessing. So now, as the story goes, God promised Moses that the people of Israel would be given a promised land, flowing with milk and honey. But unfortunately, Moses would not see it for himself. Moses would die before the people of Israel entered the promised land, and it would be up to his successor, enter Joshua, to lead them there. So this is where we pick up with our story, the Great Commissioning, the story of God choosing Joshua, and it's Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So Joshua ordered the officers of the people, go through the camp and tell the people, get your provisions ready. 3 days from now you will cross the Jordan here to go in and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you for your own. But to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, remember the command that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you after he said, the Lord your God will give you rest by giving you this land. Your wives, your children, and your livestock may stay in the land that Moses gave you east of the Jordan, but all your fighting men, ready for battle, must cross over ahead of your fellow Israelites. You are to help them until the Lord gives them rest as he has done for you, and until they too have taken possession of the land the Lord your God is giving them. After that you may go back and occupy your own land, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you east of the Jordan toward the sunrise. Then they answered Joshua, whatever you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey it, whatever you may command them will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. The word of God for us, the people of God. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So be strong and courageous. 4 times between verse 6 and verse 18. Be strong and courageous. You get the impression that God is trying to make a point. A point that God wanted Joshua to heed, to be sure, but a point for us today as well. When it comes to following God, wherever God is leading us, God essentially wants us to do 2 things. Trust and obey. Just like the old hymn says, trust and obey, for there's no other way. As someone who has a history of trust issues and a tendency to resist authority, answering God's call to trust and obey hasn't always come easy for me, and it hasn't always gone well. But mostly it's gone wrong when I've tried to go my own way and rely on my own devices instead of relying on the promises and the faithfulness of God. And here in these verses, God was sure to give Joshua necessary reminders of God's promises and God's faithfulness. First, Joshua had a promise in God's stated purpose. We see that in verse 3. God said, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Next, Joshua had the promise of God's presence with him. We read that in verse 5. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And then finally, Joshua had the promise of God's faithfulness, that he could count on God to see things through. We see that in verse 6. You will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. So, what does God require of Joshua then? In response to these commitments that God himself is making, it's really one thing that God requires of Joshua. And it's not necessarily a small thing, but it's one of those simple but not easy things. And God spells it out in verse 7. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. In other words, in no way did God want discouragement or fear to cause Joshua to hesitate or to disobey, but just to be strong and very courageous. Something that I recall to my memory quite often is a question that the vice president that I used to work for in financial services used to routinely ask our sales force. What would you do if you had no fear? He would walk into a room and say, what would you do if you had no fear? And he'd let that question hang. Now, have you ever pondered a question like that? I mean, it's a powerful one to consider. If you feared nothing, what would you do with your life? The vice president was using it to help motivate these financial advisors to push through their fear of rejection, clients saying no to their sales pitches, to get outside of their comfort zones and increase their sales to levels beyond their wildest dreams. It really was capitalism at its finest. The field vice president used to say, if you will do for 3 years what most people won't, meaning work your off, you will be able to do for the rest of your life what most people can't. That's what he used to say. And so he was like, what would you do if you had no fear? Well, over the years, I've used that question in ways that this Harvard Business School graduate who, makes more money than I will ever see in my lifetime, he never used the question this way. I mean, I used it when I was answering God's call to ministry. When I first sensed God calling me to ministry, I kind of had a Snoodle Boys response. I said, sir, are you really calling me to be a pastor? I'd really like to believe it, but sir, I'm afraid to. And I discovered, though, when I thought about it, that the reality was, if I had no fear, I would become a pastor. But that meant for me to leave financial services with a modest salary and benefits package that easily supported my family, to go to seminary full-time at almost 40 years old and make only $15,000 a year with no benefits. Now, in today's culture, you can understand why I was scared out of my pants. But God simply wanted me to trust and obey. And then once I did that, God showed me more faithfulness in his provision for my family, because in spite of my fears, we never lacked for anything. And he got me through this very long season of preparation. But if I'm being really honest, I wasn't prepared to receive that kind of faithfulness from God. There were more than a few times where God just blew my mind with how good he was to my family. So much so there was a couple of times where I just like, God, you're really showing off now. You be strong and courageous, and I'll take care of the rest, just as I promised. That's the message at the heart of Joshua's call story. You be strong and courageous, and I'll take care of the rest. Now, something else I love about this story that came to me the first time as I was reading it over and over this week. I confess, I have Joshua 1 verse 9 tattooed on my arm. But this occurred to me for the first time this week. There's this movement of conversation. In verses 1 through 9, God is speaking to Joshua. And it culminates with the verse that I have tattooed on my arm. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. God speaking to Joshua. So this is a word that Joshua needed to hear. And it's a word that we all need to hear. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. God is with you wherever you go. And it was just what Joshua needed to propel him into the next movement, which was when Joshua, as the new leader of the people of Israel, was going to address them and give them instructions and encouragement from God. Which then leads to the final movement, when the people speak to Joshua. You see that God speaking to Joshua, Joshua speaking to the people speaking to Joshua. After receiving his instructions and encouragement, they turn around and acknowledge, you're our new guy. We're going to follow you. We're going to do what it is that you've asked us to do. But the best part about it is this whole commissioning, this great commissioning, concludes with the people encouraging their new leader the same way God had encouraged them. Be strong and courageous. They said, we're going to follow you, only be strong and courageous. Now, and I just love that image of community at the end of the story. Because God himself encouraged Joshua, and then the people encouraged him in their way. And that is how it really should be for us. Because when we read God's word, when we read this story, we should find encouragement ourselves to be strong and courageous. That's why things get repeated over and again. 4 times in this passage to make sure it gets through up here. But then we gather together in places like this, where we're supposed to be God's chosen instruments and encourage one another. We can read it and feel encouraged, but I can tell you right now, when somebody personally delivers a word of encouragement to me, it goes a lot further. Because most of us do struggle with, say, negative self-image and negative self-talk that is only exacerbated by, what we see in the culture around us and what we see in the circles where we walk. For example, I regularly compare myself to other pastors. I mean, it's human nature. And we far too easily become discouraged. An encouraging word can go a long, long way in helping us on our journeys. We should know that the truth is that we are all chosen and we are all called by God for our own unique and specific purposes. For me, my specific purpose in life is to be a husband, a father, and a pastor. I shared that, here before. And so God calls me to be strong and courageous in my marriage, in my parenting, and in my pastoral vocation. So if I'm being honest with you, I am most confident in my calling, in my marriage, and that's mostly because of who I'm married to. She has a gift for bringing out the best in me. So being strong and courageous in my marriage comes easily. I also am becoming fairly comfortable with who I believe God is calling me to be as a pastor. But hopefully not in an overly confident, braggadocious, prideful kind of way, but a sincere understanding of how God has gifted me for ministry and what I have to offer the church. But even in that confidence, I'm working at becoming a more courageous pastor. I believe that being a Christian minister in the 21st century, while it's not, some of the antics of the early church, there's a lot of courage required in the world that we live in today. Now, if I'm being honest with myself, at the end of the day, where I feel most weak and most fearful is in my calling as a dad, as a father. I am scared to death of screwing up my kids. Especially now that they are preachers' kids. A friend joked with me once to not be afraid of messing up my kids, but just to make sure I set aside enough money to help pay for their counseling. You like that? I'm being serious. On my first job out of high school, I worked in loss prevention in a major department store in a mall in an inner city area and arrested shoplifters every day. I was never scared. I was on submarines and would not breathe fresh air or see sunlight for 3 months. Didn't faze me. I was a tax collector for the Internal Revenue Service in the city of Miami. That scared me a little bit. But I've done all of these things in my professional life, and none of them scare me the way that being a dad has. I mean, it's just huge, and I don't walk around, paralyzed by fear, but it's a responsibility that I own, and it's a big responsibility. And now that my oldest daughter, Gabrielle, whom I love and adore, she's my favorite firstborn, and always will be my favorite firstborn. She's 11 and in middle school, and I'm terrified. For the first time in almost 12 years of having kids, I've gone looking for an instruction manual because I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, I am completely clueless. Middle schoolers, they're like aliens. I've been bearing my soul to people about this who know me and care about me. And you know what? They've encouraged me, and it's helped so much. So much so that when I've been reading and rereading this story from Joshua, I've seen myself in it. I've been reading Joshua, and I've also been reading this book on raising middle school speak. It's been very helpful. But in reading Joshua, I see myself in the story. God telling me to be strong and courageous. You might remember a few weeks ago when I said, all that we need is here. Remember? All that we need is here and here, really. I mean, God made us. God made us. We have what we need. We just need to be ourselves and be ourselves bravely. So God is faithful to fulfill his promises, and he will see me through even these middle school years. I'm confident. So I've then now gone to Lenore and said, hey, I've been reading this book. I went to even my daughter and confessed to her, hey, I haven't always been at my best the last couple months. But, we're in new territory, you and me. And I just want you to know I'm trying really hard in reading this book. And I think that meant something to her, changed our dialogue a little bit. So I've gone to Lenore, I've gone to friends, I've gone to my daughter, said, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is the same way that Joshua went to the people, said, this is what we're going to do. And they've all responded, that sounds good. You've got this. Only be strong and courageous. So you see, that's been my experience this week. But I hope as we've been sharing this time together and you've been listening, that you've filled in the blanks with your own experiences and can see that God is calling you to just be yourself. Because we all have daily obligations. We all do different things. We all have different relationships. But God just wants us to be ourselves. He wants us to be the people that He fearfully and wonderfully made us to be. But more than that, He wants us to be those people bravely. He wants us to be strong and courageous. And then while we're trying to do that, because it sounds simple but not easy, He wants us to encourage one another along the way. So, leave here, and in your circles of influence, your families, your friends, your co-workers, find a way to help somebody be a little more strong and courageous. The psalmist gives us a wonderful reminder about all of this in Psalm 27, verse 14. And I invite you to join me in making this your prayer for this week. It can be a breath prayer. Psalm 27, verse 14. Hope in the Lord. Be strong. Let your heart take courage. Hope in the Lord. Amen.